This is Gene DeLisio with a featured sports interview from WDLB and WOSQ. Many sports fans around central Wisconsin know Hall of Fame coach Duane Teska, who coached the Colby High School football team between 1964 and 1991. Coach Teska is a native of the Auburndale area and also had an extensive baseball career, playing on the Marshfield American Legion baseball team that lost to Billy Heft and the Little Shoe team in the State American Legion baseball championship game in 1949. He also played on the Auburndale High School baseball team that played at the state tournament in 1952. We met with Coach Teska in 2017 to discuss his early memories of baseball in central Wisconsin.
Well, I was introduced to baseball by my uncle, and he was born in the 1880s somewhere. He was quite a bit older than my dad, and he was telling me about the old days when they would to go to games. Since there were very few cars and very few roads, you had to either walk to where you were playing or you take a horse and buggy or something like that. Or it was possible, if it was a little further away, that you would go to Auburndale and then jump on a train, and then from the train you'd take it to another destination. And they would do that, and he was telling me about this situation that they had in their game with Stratford that was coming up for the championship. And the Stratford club and the Auburndale club were both backed by people in the wood industry and making lumber and that type of thing. And I know the Auburndale guy was his last name was Connor, and he might have had a brother in Stratford, their biggest rivalry. That could have been his brother, but anyhow, Stratford was always beating Auburndale. So my Uncle Mike said he took the horse to town, to Auburndale, and then he took the train to Marshfield, and he got on a train that took him to Stratford. And then as he was walking toward the diamond after he left the train, he saw a strange person standing out there warming up with an Auburndale uniform on. And so as he walked in, he asked somebody, he said, "What's going on here? Who is that guy?" He said, "Well, Connor told me that he's sick and tired of getting beat by Stratford, and it's not going to happen today." He said, "Well, who is this guy?" A big black guy was warming up, and his friend told him, he said, "Well, all I know is he came from the Chicago Giants in the Negro Baseball League, and he's going to pitch for us today." He said, "I understand Connor had to pay a lot of money to get him up here, but anyhow, he's going to be pitching our game today." Well, the center fielder on that team was... I don't know his first name, but he was a Varsho, and it would be Jumbo and Andy and Dale, Jumbo and Andy, Richie, and the other Varshos was the center fielder, and my Uncle Mike played right field. And then he said in the first inning, before he went out in the outfield, he said this big black pitcher called him over with Varsho, and he said, "Now don't go very deep," he said, "because they're not going to hit it that far." So anyway, Auburndale, I think, won the game 4 or 5 or 6-0 or something like this. And Mike told me that in the last inning, him and Varsho and the other outfielder went out there. Then he turned around and he motioned for them to sit down. So he said, "I didn't feel like doing it." He said, "Sit down." Okay. So they all sat down, and then just for one batter, and then he retired the side without them scoring a run, and I think he struck out the last two guys, and that's my first entry into baseball, really. My dad didn't play ball, but as I understand it, my uncle was a pretty good player. So that's how I got my start in baseball, and then I always wanted to be a baseball player too.
And that kind of indicates the what baseball was like back in that era. Boy, there was a lot of competition between the towns. A lot of small towns had teams. Some small towns had two teams. It was very competitive. Tell us about that aspect of baseball, all the little towns that had baseball teams back in that era.
Well, in those days, there were, if you had a country store or if you had a bar out in the country, you try to get some land and cut down a few trees and bring in a grader and make a diamond and hopefully put up some kind of a backstop, and then you would have a baseball team. Now, there were a lot of those kind of places around here. One was Rock Inn, just 5 miles east of town here. They had a team. Rendezvous had a team, and they only had a bar. Little Rose had a bar and a bowling alley, and they had a team. Riverside had a bar, and they had a team. Chile had teams, and they were quite competitive. And as I was growing up, I wanted to go and see those teams play, but my mother always said, well, you go to church first, and then you can go to the ball game. Now, the only problem was we'd have church in the afternoon sometime, so that got to be a problem. So then I would walk to a different church in the morning, and then I could go to the baseball game in the afternoon, and that's the way it was with a lot of neighborhoods then.
I remember Cy Bucher telling me that March Rapids had two teams, so there was a lot of influx of baseball players out there. A lot of guys wanted to play baseball, and of course you saw a lot of the Auburndale team play as a young man, growing up in that area. Tell us about some of the early Auburndale teams that you can recall.
Well, I started playing for the Auburndale teams when I was like a freshman or sophomore in high school. And at that time, Auburndale had two teams, one in the Wood County League and one in the Yellow River League. And there were still some players left over that played with teams in Hewitt and Arpin and Blenker and places like that. So there was a lot of ball players and there was a lot of teams.
And as you mentioned, we're talking about two different things here. First of all, you're talking about the town teams that played primarily in the spring and summer, but also high school baseball teams are out there, although not to the extent that they have today. And tell us about what high school baseball was like back in that era, and you played for Auburndale.
Well, we were fortunate in a couple of ways there. Our first coach that came to Auburndale when I was a freshman was Jack Rudy from Marshfield. And he was the basketball coach and the football coach and the baseball coach. And then he brought the baseball team along pretty good, and we had some good players. Frank Vandehei in the Vandehei family was our pitcher in our senior year that pitched us to the state finals, and at that time there was no division, so we had to beat big schools to get there. And I always had admiration for Frank. Was hit with polio when he was 12 years old, and had one game leg, but he was a very tough competitor, and he was a good player, and he pitched us to the finals in the state tournament. I remember he allowed a good Eau Claire team one run, and we won that game 10-1 playing here in Marshfield in 1952. That took us to the state championship. We lost in the state championship to Hurley, and they had a catcher there. I don't remember his name, Nefurkovich. And I talked to some friends that were from that area, and they said, he signed a contract and played big-time baseball. and I think he hit 2 home runs off us in that game. But we lost that game something like 8-4, something like that.
That was a great accomplishment for you getting to the state tournament. Tell us about that experience before we get into some of these other aspects of baseball, but that experience of going to the state tournament that year with Auburndale High School.
Well, it was the first time for a lot of our players that got out of town and went down. I think we played that game at Menasha. So it was a great experience for a lot of the kids. I had gotten broken into it a little bit because I was on some of those Legion teams that went, and so was Eddie Humschild and Red Fate. And so that was quite an experience, a first-time experience for a lot of those boys.
As you mentioned, you played on the Legion team also. Let's get into some of the years before you played Legion ball, and probably, I'm guessing, had to come over here to Marshfield to play what I think they called Pee Wee baseball back at that time. Tell us about what that was like for you.
Well, that was a program started by some people here in Marshfield, and it really was well run. Anyone in the neighborhood of Marshfield could come in and sign up, and I know my mom told me, she said, I'm going to take you up there and I'll sign you up and so you can play baseball in Marshfield. Well, they put a number of us on certain teams up here, but if you were from a locale like Auburndale, they would put you on the same team so you could travel together, and you were on one of the namesake of the professional teams. Like I was on the Tigers, and some people were the Yankees, some people were the Cubs, and so on. But it was well run, and it was played with a little bit smaller ball, and the pitcher's mound was a little closer to home plate. And I remember batting off. We had Harry Larson. I played with him later in the Legion team, and he could. He could throw very hard. He could make that ball feel awful small. So that was a lot of fun. It was a great experience, and it was before my time when I joined and played on the Legion teams then.
Before we get to the Legion team, one thing I do want to ask you about Auburndale is tell us about what the baseball facility in Auburndale was like back in that era.
Well, like most of them around here, it was a farmer's field, and they put up a backstop, and they would drag the infield a little bit, and all in all, it was pretty good. It was better than a lot of the diamonds that you would play around here in the Yellow River League, so they were pretty good.
Now, you go to the Legion program to play in the late 1940s, and tell us about the circumstances that brought you to that Marshfield Legion team in 1949. Well,
I was playing I got a little known by some of the baseball people up here when I was playing in the Pee Wee leagues up here. And then the Legion team had tryouts, and my mom and dad said, well, I'll take you up there. You can try out with the Legion team. Well, and that time, I don't remember. I think it might have been a Fehrenbach that was manager, and Barr Winnick was Jerry Barr Winnick from Marshfield who was coaching. And then on that team, you know, my first experience, they were 3 years older than I was, with the guys like Merle Lindo, Jerry Witt, Wayne Weiler, Len Vandehei. There was a Byro, Linewander. There were some really not only good players, they were just all-around good athletes.
And you had some great talent on that team, and eventually wound up playing some for that ball club. Tell us about that situation.
Well, I didn't get to play much because Pud Lee was the catcher, and and we had Weiler and Witt and Lindau and Vandehei and them guys. They could score a lot of runs and they could hit the ball. But we were playing over at Wausau one time, and I didn't expect to get in the game with those guys around, but Pud Lee was a catcher, and there was a play at home, and he got injured. In fact, he broke his arm. And so then whoever the manager was said, okay, you got to go in and you got to catch now. Well, That was a lot of difference from catching in the Pee Wee League and then catching Len Vandehei, who was throwing at 90 miles an hour. And I remember they had a good player by the name of Flory, and he was Vandehei had told me, he said, he's a good hitter. He said, we got to be careful with him. And so I didn't know how to call strikes, whether it was a fastball or curveball or changeup or whatever. But Len Vandehei helped me, just get back there, you'll be okay. So I remember the first pitch or second pitch that Vandehei threw, Flory swung and it hit me right in the mask and just about tipped me over backwards, and I was blinking there, now what's going to happen next, I thought. So Vandehei came over and said, just get back, put your mask back on, and he said, we'll get him out. So anyway, that was my first experience with the Legion team.
And you played on that 1949 Legion team a little bit. Can you talk a bit about that Legion team, some of the players there that were so strong and made that team so good?
Well, as I mentioned some of their names before, we had Jerry Witt was playing in the outfield, and Len Vandehei was pitching and playing first base, and Wayne Weiler was playing shortstop and pitching, and Barr played in the outfield, and Lindo played first base in the outfield. There was a lot of talent there. That was a good team.
I want to ask you about, I've been doing some research here on some of these ball games. I found a ball game in June where you played at Wausau, beat Wausau 7-1, and probably don't remember too much about that game except that Elroy Hirsch was the umpire of that ball game. So I don't know if you remember that or anything like that.
At that time, I probably didn't even know who Elroy Hirsch was. So, no, I don't remember anything about that.
So that was quite an experience for you guys. And eventually you won a few ball games and got to the state tournament, the Legion tournament, to be held that year at West Bend. Anything you could recall about that trip or going down to that state Legion tournament that year?
Well, I can remember then that to get into the finals, I don't remember the team we were playing, but I wasn't playing. We had picked up catcher Nubs Miller from Stevens Point, a quality player. And we had picked up some other, Ron Hainish and Schrank from Mosinee. They were really good players. And we were in the semifinal game there, and we were down like 3 or 4 runs. And Nubs Miller had to go back because he had something pending the next day. So they took him and said, well, get on the bus. They said, yeah, we're 4 or 5 runs down. And we went, well, anyhow, we got a rally going there. And I remember Len Vandehei, I think, got a triple or something with the bases loaded. And Weiler got a hit, and Witt got a hit, and somebody else. Pretty soon we were ahead, and we won the game. And then they called ahead to Stevens Point because they had put that other catcher on the bus, and he said, well, when he gets off that Greyhound, you send him right back here because we're playing tomorrow against Billy Heft. So it saved me from getting into the game at all because he came back and then he caught the next day.
Yeah, the game you're talking about was against a team called Bayview, which I'm guessing is from Milwaukee, and it was a guy named Schrank had the game-winning base hit in the 9th inning.
Oh, I don't remember that at all. I know Schrank was playing, but I didn't remember he got the winning hit.
Yeah, he scored 4 runs in the 9th inning, and there was, I mentioned the double by Vandehei, an infield hit by Byroll, and Schrank had the base hit to score the winning run. So that was how you won that ball game against Bayview. And then, as you mentioned, you played what was called the Little Shoe team, actually, in the championship game, which featured Billy Heft. And I don't know that a lot of people in today's era recall Billy Heft or the reputation he had, but boy, he was very well known as a pitcher around the state back in that era. Can you give us some idea of what this guy's reputation was back then, back in the late 40s as a pitcher?
Well, he was the top prospect in the state. He was a left-handed pitcher, had a big curveball, and he could throw in the 90s. And so we knew then that, boy, that's really be something because this guy had pitched 4 years in high school. He had never, ever been beaten. So that's what we were looking for as we went into the championship game.
And you faced Little Chute, and boy, had a great ball game against them, and lost the championship game that year 4-1. But had a one-run lead in the seventh inning. Put together a little rally, and only had one hit, I believe, the entire ball game. That was a bloop double by Jerry Witt, who then came in to score. Anything you recall about that situation where Witt had that hit and eventually scored that first run?
Well, this was, I think those were 7-inning games. And I think in the fourth or fifth inning, Jerry Witt hit a pop fly back of the second baseman that fell for a hit. And they were a little slow in bringing it up, so he got to second base. So then, as I remember it, we bunted him to third base. That was the only hit we had. And then we thought, well, they're going to probably do another suicide squeeze of some kind here. But he threw a wild pitch, and then Witt came in to score. So I think that was the first time in that pitcher's record that he was ever behind. And so we were ahead 1-0. But anyhow, they managed then to come back, and they got 2 or 3 hits then, and. But one, I do remember, he struck out a lot of people, but the only batter that he never fooled was Len Vandehei. He hit a couple of hard balls and then a fly ball to the outfield, but he proved to the scouts that he could hit the big-time pitching, as an 18-year-old.
That'd be a tough loss for your ball club because, as you mentioned, Little Chute scored 4 runs in the 8th inning to come back and win that ball game, and there were some errors by Marshfield in that inning also. But nonetheless, that was a great year for the Marshfield Legion Ball Club. Coach, I want to talk about some of the individuals, if you don't mind, on that Marshfield Legion team. That had to be a lot of fun to play with those ball clubs. And you mentioned Len Vandehei. Buster Vandehei had a good minor league career, known as an outstanding hitter, especially during his pro career. Tell us a bit about Buster and some things he did out there on the field.
Well, Len Vandehei, the Vandehei family had moved from Loyal to Auburndale. So Len was the oldest boy in the family, and he decided to stay at Loyal his senior year, and all the other Vandeheis then came and lived in Auburndale with the family there, and they played for us. But I remember Len Vandehei, when I was a kid, these Clover Belt leagues around here, I mean, he used to lead the league in hitting as a 17-year-old, and he was against, most of them were adults, much older than he was, and he could hit for power, and then it wasn't, the next year after he had graduated and he had signed that contract, and he was playing in the league, the Northern League. I think it was the Northern League. And he was playing with Sioux Falls. He was in the Cub organization. And I came over with my dad and Vandehei's dad to watch the game at Eau Claire when they were playing the Eau Claire team, in the Northern League. And I remember Len getting 2 hits in that game, against the Eau Claire team. But anyhow, Sioux Falls was ahead there in the 9th inning by 1 or 2 runs. And Eau Claire got a rally going. And then I looked, I said, well, so Sioux Falls brought in a reliever, and he looked like he was throwing very hard. And it was a guy, I don't remember his name now, but I know at the time, then a little later on, he got into the major leagues. But on deck, the bases were loaded for Eau Claire, and there was a small, slender black guy that was coming to bat, and I told my dad, I said, I feel sorry for that poor kid because he looks like he's, 150 pounds, and he's not going to be ready for that guy. Well, that kid stepped in batter's box and took one pitch and hit it over the fence in left center, won the ball game, and I found out who was that guy. Well, that was Hammer and Hank Aaron.
You saw some great ball players back in that era, and Len certainly was one of them. Let's talk about some other guys you played for with that Legion team. One guy I want to talk about is Wayne Wilder, because we think of Wayne for his football and basketball career at Marshfield High School and don't think of him too much for baseball, but he was a great baseball player as well, wasn't he?
Well, he was all-around great athlete, and as fine an athlete as he was even a better person. He kind of took me under his wing a little bit and showed me around, and then there are times when I had to catch him, and it was a great experience to have him on that team and have him. I looked up to him.
And some other guys on that team. Let's get some comments from you on some of these other ball players. Merlin Lindau was a key man on that ball club, and he was a nice player and also very good in some other sports as well.
Well, I really enjoyed playing with Merle Lindau. I played with him on some other teams a little later on, and Merle was a great guy. He was fun to be around, and I enjoyed being his teammate, and he was a fighter on the baseball team as well as in the ring.
Certainly a very fine ball player. How about Don Byrell, who was also a key man on that ball club?
Well, I never got to know Byrell very good, but he had some significant hits when we were playing in those tournaments. He was an all-around good player.
And anybody else on that team that you recall that you'd like to make some mention of?
Well, of course, we had Jerry Witt on the team, by far the fastest guy. I think he was the state champion in the 100 and the 220. And he, of course, went down to Madison and was a big-time player for the Badgers. So I enjoyed playing with 4 or 5 of those guys. They were really outstanding athletes and all-around good players.
I want to talk about some other ball players that you're familiar with or may have seen. And, of course, in this area, the Varsho family certainly well known, not only Gary but his father and his father's brothers. But you go back a few years and heard some stories about Gary's grandfather, Leo Varsho, what kind of ball player he was. Tell us about your experience and learning about him. Well,
that is, I should have clued you in on this before, because that Varsho is the Varsho that played with my uncle on that team over in Stratford. In fact, I checked this out. I called up Andy the other day, and he said, yeah, his dad was born in 1898, I believe. I can tell you another thing about the Varshos in that family. There was Weedy and Richard and Andy and Jumbo. And is that my dad had a milk route, and one of the patrons that we would pick up their milk was out on the Varsho farm, just a little south of Hewitt. And I remember I was probably 10, 12 years old, and I was trucking. Dad had put the cans on the truck already, and then I heard this banging going on, and I said, hey, Dad, what's going on there? He said, come on, I'll show you. So he took me up in the barn, and there was Jumbo was pitching, and Andy was batting, in between the hay mows, and then they would hit it against the wall, and then the other guy would bat, and the other guy would pitch, and that was the beginning of the Varshos there, following in their dad's steps that I just mentioned a few minutes ago.
And the Varshos all had some great talent. Let's talk about some of those guys. Jumbo Varsho, perhaps a guy who is well known by baseball fans, as a great player, as a hitter and as a pitcher. So tell us about what made him a special ball player.
Well, as a kid, I used to go watch Jumbo play, and I enjoyed him. And then I told my dad, I said, when I get big, I think I'd like to play for Hewitt. Well, finally, that time came around, and so I joined Hewitt. And then Jumbo was gone at that time. He was he was in a little stint with the Wausau team in the Wisconsin State League, and so I was playing there. But then about halfway through, he was released, and he came back, and my first idol in baseball was Jumbo, and then I got a chance to catch him and play with him, and play with Andy, his younger brother.
And Jumbo, I understand, was, as you mentioned, a great hitter, a great pitcher. He's a guy who could really do everything, couldn't he?
Jumbo was one of the all-around players. He played first base, outfield. He hit for power. He hit for a percentage, and he was a real leader.
Great ball player, certainly. And Andy's certainly a fine player, a guy who could have played some pro ball himself. Tell us about Andy Varsho, who I understand was a much different ball player, type of player than Jumbo.
Well, Andy was as good a hitter as I ever played with, probably outside of Len Vandehei. I mean, he played, probably 15, 16 years around here. One thing about Andy, he never got a leg hit because he couldn't run a lick. But, boy, he hit a lot of line drives.
And the other Varshos, Rich and Gene Varsho, very talented ball players as well.
Well, all those contributed to some real good Hewitt teams in those days.
How about some other young men or men from that era? I want to talk about a couple of pitchers that you've talked about. One is Jackie Hague, whose name crops up from time to time. Tell us about Jackie Hague and what he did on the mound.
Well, I got a chance to catch Jackie Hague when we both played for Auburndale for about, that was probably 5, 6, 7 years. And Jack could put more spin on a ball than any player I've ever seen, and so, of course, then he could have tremendous curveballs. He had a drop that was good, a sidearm curveball, a three-quarter curveball, and he had enough speed. He was one of the best pitchers at that time in this area.
And another guy who you saw was Jackie Leonard, who pitched about the same time. Tell us about him.
Well, Jackie Leonard, when I started playing, he played minor league ball, and I played against him when I played for Abbotsford one year, and then I played with him on a Arpin team. I think that was at the state tournament, and even in my college days, I think that Jackie Leonard was the fastest pitcher that I ever faced.
You from Auburndale, and when we talk about pitchers in Auburndale, a lot of people think about John Bauer, but before John, you mentioned Ed Humshold, who was a fine pitcher as well. Tell us about Ed Humshold.
Ed was the best player on our baseball team, and we went to the state tournament. And then, of course, Ed then was our second pitcher back of Frank Vandehei as we went to the state tournament. And then Ed went and he had a business in Arpin, and he played baseball for Arpin there with, man, Ed hit many home runs, and not only was he was a good shortstop, and percentage-wise he was a good hitter. He was one of the better all-around players that I played with.
Fine ball player he was. And the Neve family down there in the Cary Bluff area, I understand, was a group of very fine ball players also. Tell us about those young men. Well,
I played against Don and Larry Neve. They were playing Cary Bluff in the Pittsville area, and they had played 4 years of college ball at University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. And then there was a Frank Neve, and there was 2 or 3 more Neves, and they were all quality players. And you mentioned John Bauer before. Donnie Neve told me not too long ago when I asked him about players that he played against, he said Johnny Bauer was the best pitcher that he ever faced.
And John certainly was a very good one. How about some other guys that you may have recalled from that era that that we should mention and remember?
Well, let's see. I mentioned briefly before about this Bruce Johan that was pitching for Arpin at the time, and he played like 3 or 4 years in the minors also. He was one of the better pitchers ever in this area. And I know Glenn Sear, the manager of Arpin, called me up there sometime in the late 50s, and they were in a tournament. They had a good team because they had the Humschel playing, and then Johan, and he said, would you join us? We got one playoff game we got to play to get to the state tournament. And he said, you'll be catching Bruce Johan. I said, I'd glad to join that team. So anyhow, we played Loyal in that game, and Bruce Johan threw a perfect game. He retired every man and struck out 19. So he was truly one of the, and of course, his minor league record was good, but a lot of those times the minor leagues didn't play too good, and if those guys got a better offer from the lumber or from the paper mill down at Nakusa, Wisconsin Rapids, then they would say, well, I got to give up my professional baseball here, and I got to go to work and support my family, and as I understand it, Bruce Johan was one of those.
Coach, let's talk about what it was like to watch baseball back in that era when you had all these little town teams playing each other, and Stratford versus Auburndale or Little Rose versus Hewitt, things like that, and what the atmosphere was like and how important it was to the local population to have these games out there.
Well, those games were highly contested, and each would have a pretty good following. And you'd bring a chair along, or you would sit in your car, or you'd stand usually along the sidelines and root for your team and razz the other players and so on. So it was a great experience. You have to remember, in those days, there wasn't four-wheelers, and we didn't have snowmobiles, and most of them didn't even have cars. So what they looked forward to was Sunday, and the baseball games are going to be on Sunday, and so the family kind of centered around that.
And there were some great rivalries back in that era, some wonderful games played back in that time as well. We also, some people might be a bit confused about the leagues because there was a Clover Belt League, a Yellow River League, there was a Wisconsin Valley League. Can you talk about the leagues, the differences there may have been between the leagues back in that era?
Well, the old Clover Belt League out here, which was would have been Loyal and Neilsville and Abbotsford and Thorpe and so on, was probably a little bit better league than was around here with the Wood County League and the Yellow River League. But you'd always see a lot of people at those games, and the whole community, enjoyed their players. You could look out on the field, and sometimes you'd find players that didn't have a uniform on. Well, a lot of these guys, they were farming, or I had a neighbor there that they made cheese, and they had to work like everything so that they could get there just in time for the ball game to start at about 2:30, and they didn't have time to change clothes, so you could see some batters were out there with their bib overalls on yet.
That was quite an era for baseball. You got a list here of some other ball players we want to talk about. Let's talk about Tom Krause, who was a standout pitcher here in Marshfield, played some minor league baseball as well.
Yes, Tom Krause was a fun guy to play with, and he really enjoyed his baseball, telling his story how he one time held a record because he's the only player around here that ever stole first base. He was on first base, and Len Vandehei was batting, and he stole second because Tom could really run. And then, of course, now they're going to give an intentional walk to the best hitter around, and that was Len Vandehei. So anyhow, as Tom tells it, I didn't see it. This is what Tom said. So he stole first base back again, and he put the bat back in Len Vandehei's hand.
And Tom was quite a pitcher also, had a nice delivery. Did you ever see him pitch or bat against him?
Well, when he came back after, I think we played one time out of town here, and I caught him in one game, and I might have played in another game in a tournament up north somewhere. But John Bauer was a real talent. He won a state championship for Auburndale in baseball there. And John kind of got shafted by he was with the White Sox organization, and he had played like 4 or 5 years at AAA ball, and he would not embarrass the team by bringing him up, and at least he could have talked to his grandkids and say, I played in the major leagues. But John never played in the major leagues, but he should have.
Coach, do you have any understanding of why it is that you had that group that came through there for about 10 or 15 years in Auburndale that had so much great talent, just starting with Frank Vandehei, and then, as we mentioned, Ed Humshold, and then John Bauer, Mickey Vandehei. Boy, some great talent came through that town in a very brief period, and you won a state championship in 1960, went to the state finals again, as you mentioned, 52. But what was it about Auburndale that brought out so many good baseball players?
Yeah, and then in 64, they had Mickey Vandehei playing, and then they went a long ways that time too. They could have easily won a state championship at that time. There just was an atmosphere in Auburndale at the time, about baseball, and it was more so than any other sport. But you had to play baseball. And when you were a little kid, like I was watching those games, I couldn't wait for the chance when maybe someday I'd get a chance to put a uniform on and I could play for the home team. But we had a lot of fan support, and there was a lot of talent. Now, of course, you got to mention a guy like that Jordan Zimmerman, playing in the major leagues. But there were a lot of players. Well, you take in small communities, Tom Krause and Gary Varsho, both coming from Rosalville. Now that's really something. And there were a lot of good players in those days.
You mentioned Mickey Vandehei. I'm sure you had a chance to see Mickey play as well. Talk, if you would, about his talent and what made him a special player.
Well, I saw a lot of Mickey play, and I just when he had retired, and I think I played with him 1 or 2 games, not very much, but Mickey was a real talent, and I went to his high school games, and he was followed by a lot of scouts, or most of them throughout the state here. In fact, then Mickey didn't sign his bonus contract. He went out to play in the Basin League. And then we went out there. I went out there with Mickey's brother Len and watched him play the last game, and then brought him back home. And I know there were scouts that came in the car, wanted to talk to Len, since Len was apparently the advisor to Mickey. And I know Bertie Tabbets one time, I might have told you this story, but he was sitting in the car with us, and he said, what's it going to take to sign Mickey? So Len said, give him a figure, and he said, well, we can't pay that. We can't pay that. He said, well, that's what the going rate is now. And so Len then, he said he had to go to the bathroom or get some popcorn or something, but this former major leaguer and a scout for the Cleveland Indians said, what's that guy doing? And I said, he's coaching in high school. He said, I know of him. And he said he should be coaching major leaguers how to hit. And so that's what he had to say about another member of the Vandehei family.
Yeah, Len always known as a great hitter, and he certainly, if he could run a bit more, probably would have been in the major leagues as well. But he had that ankle injury, and that was really a killer for him, wasn't it?
Well, not only that, but at that time he had been in the service, and he was eligible for a GI Bill. And now it's coming time. Well, with this injury, where am I going to go? And if I don't use the GI Bill to go on to college, then I'm going to lose it. So he made the decision then, and he went over to University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and I saw him play basketball. He was a heck of a basketball player. And then I got a chance to play against him when I was playing for River Falls and he was playing for Eau Claire. I got a chance to bat off him when our two teams met.
Let's talk about some other guys you got on the list here. Jerry Barr Winnick is a guy who may have preceded you somewhat, but tell us about Jerry and what he did for you.
Well, Jerry Barr Winnick would come and help out with the Legion teams when I was on it, and showed me some techniques in catching and throwing and stuff like that. He was a big help in my baseball career.
And you never saw him play, but I guess, or probably didn't see him play, but I guess he was considered a pretty good ball player at one time also.
Yes, he was. I saw him play a few times. He at one time they played with a dandy team. I was in the service at a time, but they had Barr Winnick was the catcher for a Hewitt team, and they had Humschel was playing with them, and Poppy was playing there, and Jimmy Vandehei was playing, and they went and played a lot of tournaments. Then that was a really fine team.
Jack Rudy, who, as you mentioned, was a Marshfield guy who coached for many years at Auburndale. Tell us about him.
Well, of course, we got to know Jack Rudy when I started high school, and he was kind of inspiration to all of us. In fact, I had remember seeing Jack Rudy play at one time for the team I mentioned before, Rock Inn. Excuse me, and then Jack coached us in football, basketball, and baseball. And if it wouldn't have been for Jack Rudy, I'd have never got into coaching. So I owe a lot to him.
All right, some other guys that you have on your list. Let's see who's out there also. What do you? I can't read the next name, so you have to help me with this one.
Well, I got some notes here, and he can't read my notes, and I got trouble reading the ones I made. And I mentioned Harry Zaleski, and this is Gordy Wicks of Marshfield. I always liked him. He was a good player, too, a very versatile player, good left-handed batter. Another guy from town here was Buddy Hine. He was a good player also. And then I played a couple of years with Donnie Wagner. He was all around good athlete from Stratford and a good pitcher in his day.
And you mentioned Harry Zaleski, who was from the Granton area, and you remember Harry also was a kind of a shortstop, middle infielder type player. Tell us about Harry.
Yeah, Harry was a real good athlete. He could run and he could throw and he could hit, and it was fun playing baseball with him.
Well, we've gone through a lot of guys here. Anything else about baseball from back in the old days you'd like to comment about?
Well, that about covered it. I hope we haven't bored too many of our radio fans here. But it was an interesting time, and it was a lot of fun, and I met a lot of good people, and I only wish I could do it over again.
You mentioned we had talked about that 1949 team, and I want to get your thoughts again on what that experience was like for a young man from Auburndale, 14, 15 years old, going to a state tournament like that, and that'd be going down to West Bend for that tournament. That'd be quite a thrill for you.
Well, the guys that I was playing with there, or I was sitting on the bench and watching play, whatever the situation was, you know, they were good people, they were good athletes, they were good players, they were fun to be around, and they taught me a lot about baseball and the work you got to put in to do it, and it was a fun time.
Longtime Colby High School football coach and Auburndale native Duane Teska with his memories of baseball in central Wisconsin in the 1940s and 50s. This is Gene DeLisio reporting for WDLB and WOSQ.